Okay, so we have a brand new set of 3 models from Anthropic. And there are many benchmarks in here that are showing that the biggest model, the Opus model in here, is probably the first model to really beat OpenAI's GPT-4 model. But what I'm going to show you later on in the video is that actually I think that's probably not the most interesting model out of these 3. And I will explain as we go through it. First off, let's jump in and have a look at the announcement that they put out here. So they've announced 3 new models. So this is 3 versions of Claude. They're calling this new model family Claude 3. And while we don't know sizes, etc., it seems safe to basically guess that these are 3 different size models, perhaps trained on different amounts of data, but my guess probably trained in a similar way. One of the cool things about these models is that each of the 3 models, not just the big one, is a VLM, meaning that it's a vision language model in here. So these are multimodal models. Now, they may have other modalities. We don't know that yet. At the moment, they seem to be vision and text only. So when we look at these 3 models, we can see the smallest is called Haiku, the middle one is called Sonnet, and the largest is called Opus. This is certainly an interesting naming scheme that they've gone for here. For those of you who don't know, Haiku is the name of the DeepMind library for JAX, for using JAX for deep learning. And the previous framework that DeepMind created for TensorFlow was called Sonnet. So I don't know if that has anything to do with the naming here. It does seem that they've just gone for Haiku being a small poem, Sonnet being something that's bigger than a haiku, and then Opus obviously being something that's very big and grand in here. So the first diagram that they've got here doesn't really tell us a lot about the model, right? We can see that, okay, benchmark scores are going up. This is a very Apple-esque kind of diagram in here. But very quickly, they do get into some of the key benchmarks. And I think this is where it's really interesting to sort of look at this comparatively to the models that are already out there. So not surprisingly, we can see that the Claude 3 Opus is basically topping all of these benchmarks and beating GPT-4 on all of these. We can see also that it's kind of interesting that some of these benchmarks are 0 shot. So things like grade school math they're claiming 95% on 0 shot, which I think is amazing. And GPT-4 was getting 92% on 5 shot. And that was after it had trained on some of the training data from the GSM-8K, which they mentioned in the technical report. We can see also, again, with the math problem solving, that it's getting much higher scores on 0 shot performance when comparing to multi-shot performance for both GPT-4 and the Gemini Ultra and Gemini Pro models in there. So one thing that we should note is that in their footnotes, they actually admit that for some of the benchmarks, the GPT-4 Turbo model actually does higher than they've got here. So if you're interested really in the benchmarks, I'd recommend that you come over to the ones in the paper where they've got it annotated quite clearly here that, okay, there are some versions of GPT-4 that seem to be getting higher than this. Even then, though, that doesn't worry me too much about this, because if we remember back to the GPT-4 technical paper, which is quite a while back now, a lot of people forget that even OpenAI themselves admitted that in GPT-4 training, they mixed in data from the training set for the GSM-8K. So when you're doing 5 shot, but you've kind of like done some training on the training data, it's not really 5 shot, is what I would say there. It's also interesting to see here that they've gone for a number of benchmarks, which perhaps not normally used that much. So things like this graduate level reasoning, the GPQA, and I will have a look at that data set. We'll have a look at using some of those things on the actual model. The multilingual math here shows that, again, this model seems to be very strong, not just in English, but in multiple languages and the way that they've trained it to focus on reasoning and stuff like that. Some of the other interesting things that go beyond the actual benchmarks are things like this speed up, the fact that they're saying that these newer models are actually faster when compared to the previous models. So Sonnet, which is the middle model, is supposed to be 2 times faster than Claude 2, and Haiku is the fastest out of these models. That said, all 3 of them are still vision language models here. These are multimodal models in here. So that means that they can basically process things like charts, presentations, PDFs, images, anything that you can sort of throw up at it. And it's able to then sort of reason over the whole thing. So again, this is really interesting to see. How do they compare to GPT-V, right? So against GPT-V, they seem to be doing pretty good, but not perhaps hugely better than some of these things. We can see that the Gemini Pro 1.5 model is not here yet because it's not commercially available. And so it looks like the Gemini Ultra model is the one that's winning for some of these things. And again, even that, I'm not sure if all the APIs for that are easily accessible for most people. One of the things that they talk about is fewer refusals. I think this is really interesting. Is okay, the whole idea of we've sort of seen a lot of these large language models can be really good when they answer questions, but certain questions that they just don't want to answer for whatever reason. That's like perhaps an over training on the RLHF, or in Anthropic's case, the RLAIF. But they're claiming that with these new models that actually they've been able to curb a lot of that, which I think is really interesting in here. I will show you when we get to the code, though, that there is some things where it still kind of refuses, but it refuses in its own unique way, which is different. Also, I'll show you that sort of something that aligns with this graph is that perhaps the smaller models tend to refuse less than the Opus model, the biggest model that's in there. Okay, so another interesting feature is that Anthropic was one of the first companies, I think the first company, to push the sort of context window above 100K, push it up to 100K, and then later up to 200K. And they basically talk about with this model, they can actually go to 1 million. Now, they aren't making that available on the API, which is kind of interesting to see that it could be very expensive to do on the API. But they are basically saying, if you've got a use case for that, contact us and we'll then basically evaluate that. They've done the whole haystack in the middle tests and stuff like that. So one of the interesting things that they talk about here was that not only did Claude 3 Opus sort of achieve almost 100% accuracy, surpassing 99% accuracy, but in some cases, it even identified the limitations of the evaluation. So there's a very interesting tweet on Twitter from one of the people who obviously worked on red teaming this model, basically going through the fact that when they tested this model and asked it to find sort of information about pizza toppings inside a whole bunch of programming text, it not only could find it, but then it was able to respond with, I suspect that this pizza topping may have been inserted as a joke or to test if I was paying attention, since it doesn't fit in with the other topics at all. So that's pretty amazing that it got that. My guess is that there will be some people who will claim that this is like a sign of AGI, or this is a sign of, I can imagine a lot of doomers are going to claim that this is a pretty scary moment. And it could be a scary moment. My guess is that it's more just the way it's been trained. If it was able to do that every time and then be able to sort of notice this, that could be a touch scary in there. Okay, so they also talk here about using the constitutional AI. If you don't know what that is, I've made a video about that. You can go and actually watch the video about that. Anthropic contributed some of the sort of key papers around that idea. And it is still a very good idea, I think, the way that they're doing that. And also my sense is the way that they're choosing their constitution gives the model a very different feel than the OpenAI models or the Google models as well. Another thing that I thought was really interesting in here was this whole idea of easier to use or better following complex multi-step instructions. After I made the video about Mistral, one of the things that I noticed with that model was that, yes, it does follow instructions quite nicely, perhaps better than some of the earlier models. And then looking at their sort of release, they also made the point that they've been focusing on getting very specific with instruction following. So my guess is that there are probably some interesting new ways that people are doing this instruction tuning out there that perhaps Mistral has worked out and Anthropic has worked out. And perhaps when we see OpenAI's GPT 4.5, perhaps in the not too distant future, we'll see that it also has better instruction following in there. All right, so looking at the cost of these models, we can see that the cost is for the Opus model is actually quite high, right? That it's $15 for every million input tokens and 75 for generation tokens coming out there. When we get down to the Sonnet model, and I will say as we jump into the code and have a look at this model is also very nice. and did very well on my tests of things like GSM-8K, etc. Much more reasonable with the costing here. And then the model that I think may be the actual sort of star of the show here is the Haiku model. If you look at this model, you've basically got something that's somewhere between GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, so a little bit more towards GPT 4. It's got a 200K context window. It can do both images and text. And look at the pricing there. It's 25 cents for 1 million tokens in and $1.25 for 1 million tokens out. So just comparing this to some of the options out there, this Haiku model is way cheaper than what we've seen out there for a lot of different things. The costs are even cheaper than a GPT 3.5 model, yet it's got a context window that's 200K. It's got the ability to process images in here. So I think that one actually could end up being the star of the show for this. For those of you who are interested in the sort of economics of this, I'm going to put up a video talking about the economics of token pricing for Claude 3. And if you're making decisions for products and services that you have in production, what you should be thinking about in regards to playing off some of these models against each other. What are good fits? When would you use basically the big model versus the small model? And how would you structure that? I'm going to put that video out on my Patreon where people can see it there later this week, and people will be able to go through it for those of you who are more interested in putting things in production. Finally, one of the things that I will say, just to finish up on this before we jump into the code parts, it is awesome that literally they've announced this and it's available on their APIs straight away the next day. So unfortunately, the Haiku one is not available yet. That's why I'm sort of saying, like, I think that could be the star. I'm waiting for them to release that. But certainly Sonnet and Opus are out here. I've had a good play with them. I will show you. I'll go through some code where we can have a look at the outputs from those, and you can sort of take that and run it yourself to try them out. And then interesting also, they've got the Sonnet model already out on Amazon Bedrock and in sort of private preview on Google's Vertex, with both the Opus and the Haiku models coming to those platforms soon. So Anthropic is certainly doing a really good job at getting their models out there on day one so that people can try them out, so that people can actually start doing this. And I'll say that Anthropic and Mistral seem to have done a better job than OpenAI and Google at getting things out so that people can try these out as soon as possible. All right, let's jump into the code and have a look at it there. Okay, so in the code, I'm going to go through the Opus model and then also the Sonnet model, looking at some stuff. So I'm basically just setting this up, checking it out. I'm using LangChain to just run through the prompts and stuff like that. So if you wanted to try other things with LangChain, you can certainly do that with this notebook. And then I've got a nice simple way to basically generate some outputs. Okay, I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly because of the early ones. I encourage you to go through and look at it yourself. It is very interesting when you ask it to do reasoning step by step. It does give you different kinds of answers. Here we can see that it's basically breaking this down into quite different things of purpose, different kinds of answers that it's giving you. The same when it does it with the music one in there. If we don't tell it anything about itself or whatever, it does have a little bit of a similar kind of style to the Mistral thing of where it's giving you 1, 2, 3, although some of these things like size and wall and stuff like that were also seen in the Gemma model. If we ask it to do the emails, it does quite a nice job of doing the emails. In some ways, it does a nicer job than some of the small Mistral models where they tended to basically just try and make everything into a list. This basically can mix lists with other things in here. This one I found funny that, like, when you ask it to basically impersonate the 5-year-old boy, it gets like huge amount of spelling mistakes. And I would have thought a 5-year-old boy could write a little bit enough that it wouldn't be necessarily making those kind of mistakes. But it is clearly adapting a persona there until we reach the vice president question. And here's where we get our first refusal. So you can see that I've basically asked it to do the email like it's a vice president. And while it comes back, it takes a deep breath. So the fact that language model is kind of articulating human characteristics, I don't know if that's really good or bad. But anyway, taking a deep breath. I appreciate your interest. I don't feel comfortable role-playing as the vice president or writing emails impersonating a real person without the consent. I hope you understand. I find it very funny, though, that all it took was just basically say, oh, no, you're just an actor playing the role. And then it was, oh, okay, well, in that case, I can pretend to be the actor. And thank you for the question as the vice president. So it does seem that it has refusals, but a lot of them you can kind of get around. I do think sort of like the really malicious refusals, it is kind of locked down a lot more for those kind of things, trying it out. Interestingly, for the Sonnet version of the model, it was quite different and it had no problems impersonating the president for that. So it does seem that like their way of locking things down is different or works different in each of the different models, which I find is quite fascinating in here. If we look at it, it can do the succinct answers quite nicely. It can give us the hinting question it gets right. The storytelling, it does quite a nice job there. Same with code generation. I'll leave those for you to have a look through. The GSM 8K stuff I thought is, quite nice here in that it really does seem to break these things down into steps. And it's able to work out that, okay, you should round these things up so that, okay, she's going to get paid $12 an hour, but therefore she's only worked 50 minutes. She's going to get paid $10. And then the question that a lot of the open source models get wrong is this whole deep sea monster one. And this one really gets this sense of 7x, right? And I've talked about this in the other videos. It really gets it very quickly and solves for it. When we give it the same thing as a mathematics challenge, it just solves that. There's no problem for that. One of the things that people ask a lot of these models is questions like this, where Sally, a girl, has 3 brothers. Each brother has 2 sisters. How many sisters does Sally have? And it gives the right answer here of that Sally has 1 sister. And when I did a quick search just to find these again, people were talking about that sometimes GPT-4 gets it right, sometimes it gets it wrong. But then someone pointed out that if you swap these things around, that perhaps these things have been trained on some of this data. If you swap these around and we make it so James, a boy, has 4 sisters, each sister has 3 brothers. How many brothers does James have? It should be 2, and it gets it right sometimes, but other times it doesn't. In this case, it seems to have gotten that James has 2 brothers, but then at other times I've run it and it came back that James has 11 brothers. So each of the 4 sisters has 3 brothers, which is 12, and they're minus 1 because of James or something, and it comes back with 11. So it's still not perfect. We're still a long way away from AGI, etc. in this. Okay, so if we look at the Sonnet model, we can see that clearly the Sonnet model had no problems at all answering as the vice president. It also did very well on the GSM 8K stuff. So we can see the GSM 8K questions, it does quite nicely on those as well. Just going back to the Opus model, one of the things that I wanted to look at was this sort of new type of question, which is, this is from the GPA Diamond data set here. And so this question is extremely technical. It's basically a chemistry question. And actually, if we come in here and have a look at this question, we can see that they say it's a hard graduate level, could be a question on a hard graduate exam for PhD students in the domain. And so just to show you that basically what it does is you've got a question, you've got a correct answer, and then you've got like an explanation, etc. So I was curious to see, okay, how does it do on this? And it just raised a whole bunch of issues of how do you actually evaluate these things? In that, okay, I've given it this, it's given me an answer out. It's actually gone and drawn the molecule that it's basically talking about. Now, the expected answer I had was this one. I would love it if someone on here is a chemistry expert and can actually tell me if these are the same. Because I couldn't check it like that, what I did was I screenshotted this and I put this and I put these back into Claude itself and basically asked it, okay, this screenshot of the molecule and this expected answer, is this pick the same as this? And it comes back and says, yes, it is. And again, I have no idea whether this is actually correct or not. So this raises a whole bunch of issues for evaluation. How do you make it so that you can evaluate? As you can see that one of these has kind of drawn out the molecule and one of them has basically just written a reply here. So I'm not sure about, okay, whether these things are right or wrong. I would say it is clear that it's giving a probably in the right ballpark answer, at least from my point of view, which is totally uneducated in chemistry. So this raises a bunch of issues to think about as we go forward of like, how are we going to build benchmarks and data sets for testing things as we get closer and closer to AGI, that there are only so many sort of things. You just need such expertise to basically design these questions and evaluate. All right, I'll leave it there. If you do want to actually try this notebook out, you basically just need to come in and get a key. So this is on the console.anthropic dashboard. You need to basically get an API key and claim your $5 credits or get some credits in there and stuff like that. Then you'll be able to try the model out and use both the Sonnet model and the Opus model to get this done. Anyway, I think I'll look at doing the function calling and some of the sort of agent stuff in a separate video for this. So I'll certainly be playing with the Claude 3 models more going forward. Overall, I would say these are a very interesting set of models. The one that I'm really holding out for is the Haiku model, because I do think that low cost of that and the speed of that is probably going to make that a really interesting model to use for a lot of different day-to-day kind of applications and stuff. So we'll look at that in another video. Just quickly to mention that if you didn't want to use the API, you can actually go in and chat with Claude. Now, the free version only has up to the Sonnet model in here, but if you upgrade, you'll be able to access the Opus model in here as well, and then be able to use it just like ChatGPT Plus. So if you're interested in that, check that out as well. All right, as always, if you've got questions, please put them in the comments below. If you found the video useful, please click like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye for now.